She served the mansion for 40 years. The greedy son was going to destroy his father's legacy, but on Christmas Eve, she discovered the secret that changed everything. A devoted housekeeper, a historic mansion, a Christmas Eve tradition that spans generations. When greed threatens to destroy everything, Margaret has known for 40 years at Patterson Manor, a series of mysterious clues left behind by the late William Patterson may hold the key to saving not just a building, but an entire community's Christmas spirit. As the snow falls on a small Vermont town, an unforgettable tale of loyalty, family bonds, and holiday miracles is about to unfold. Some traditions are worth fighting for, and some secrets are meant to be revealed only when the Christmas stars align. Settle in for a heartwarming story that will remind you of the true meaning of the season. Watch as this touching Christmas tale reveals that sometimes the greatest gifts can't be wrapped, and the most precious inheritances aren't measured in dollars. The early morning snow crunched under Margaret's boots as she cleared the pathway leading to Patterson Manor. At 68, her back wasn't what it used to be, but 40 years of tending to this grand old house had taught her that some things just needed to be done right. The brass doorknobs needed polishing, the oriental rugs needed careful vacuuming, and the front walkway needed to be cleared before anyone else arrived, just as Mr. William Patterson had always liked it. William Patterson. The thought of him made Margaret pause, leaning on her snow shovel. Just a week ago she had stood in this very spot, watching as they carried his casket down these same steps. The entire town of Millers Creek, Vermont had turned out for the funeral, their black coats stark against the pristine December snow. Even now, the Christmas wreath she'd hung on the massive front door wore a black ribbon, a small tribute to the man who had been so much more than just her employer. "Really, Margaret? Still doing the shoveling yourself?" The sharp voice cut through her memories like an icy wind. Richard Patterson stood at the top of the steps, his Italian leather shoes completely inappropriate for the Vermont winter. Behind him, two men in business suits consulted tablets and smartphones. "Good morning, Mr. Richard." Margaret straightened up, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't expect you until next week." Plans change. Richard adjusted his cashmere scarf with manicured fingers so different from his father's work-worn hands. "These gentlemen are from Brighton Real Estate. They'll be assessing the property today." The snow shovel nearly slipped from Margaret's grip. "Assessing? But surely, the market is excellent right now," Richard spoke as if explaining something to a child. "Downtown Millers Creek is developing rapidly. This property is worth far more than the old house sitting on it." He gestured to the men. "Shall we begin inside?" Margaret's hands trembled as she unlocked the front door. The warm air inside carried the scent of pine and cinnamon. She'd been baking Christmas cookies just yesterday, carrying on the tradition of filling the house with holiday treats as she had every December for decades. "We won't be needing any of the usual Christmas preparations this year," Richard announced, brushing past her. "No point in decorating a house that's going on the market." "But the Christmas Eve dinner," Margaret's voice caught. The Patterson family Christmas Eve dinner had been a tradition for 80 years. Every year, 50 guests, family, staff, and local folks down on their luck, gathered for a magical evening of food, carols, and celebration. "Cancelled," Richard said flatly. "Most of the regular guests were Dad's friends anyway." "Times change, Margaret. Speaking of which, we should discuss your retirement package." The word retirement hit her like a physical blow. This house wasn't just her workplace. It was her home. William had promised, but the thought remained unfinished as Richard led the realtors into the library. Alone in the foyer, Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. She moved automatically to William's study, needing the comfort of the room where she and the old man had shared so many cups of tea and conversations over the years. The morning sun streaming through the window caught something white peeking out from behind the heavy desk. Bending down with creaking knees, Margaret retrieved an envelope that had slipped between the desk and the wall. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized William Patterson's distinctive handwriting. The envelope was sealed with red wax, impressed with the family crest, and bore a simple instruction: to be opened when the snow falls on Christmas Eve. From the library came the sound of Richard's voice. "We'll want to start clearing everything out immediately. Furnished houses are harder to sell." Margaret slipped the letter into her apron pocket, her heart pounding. In 40 years, William Patterson had never done anything without a reason. As she listened to Richard and the realtors discussing the mansion's development potential, she wrapped her fingers around the letter, drawing comfort from its presence. The snow was falling harder now, big flakes swirling past the windows. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Richard talking about property values and market trends. But Margaret stood still, holding William's letter, remembering his last words to her. "Trust in Christmas, Margaret. Some traditions are meant to last forever." Margaret waited until Richard and the realtors left before climbing the narrow stairs to the attic. She needed to check on the Christmas decorations. Generations of Patterson family treasures that Richard seemed eager to discard. The attic had always been her favorite place in the house, full of memories and history. As she pushed open the heavy door, dust motes danced in the light from the small window. The space felt different today, almost expectant. Box after box of Christmas decorations lined the walls, each one carefully labeled in her own handwriting. But something caught her eye. A trunk she'd never noticed before, pushed far back under the eaves. The old brass lock gave way easily, probably weakened by age. Inside, beneath a layer of yellowed tissue paper, she found a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon and a collection of black and white photographs. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted out the first photo. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. The image showed two children in winter clothes standing in front of Patterson Manor. The boy she recognized immediately, William Patterson, at perhaps 10 years old. But the girl beside him. Margaret sat down hard on an old chest, her legs suddenly weak. The girl in the photograph was unmistakably her mother. The sound of car doors slamming snapped her back to the present. Voices drifted up from below. Richard was back, and he wasn't alone. Margaret quickly returned the photo to the trunk, but kept one letter, tucking it into her pocket alongside William's sealed envelope. "The furniture can all go to auction," a woman's voice echoed through the house. "Antiques are so last century." Victoria Patterson's heels clicked on the hardwood floors as she moved from room to room. Margaret made her way downstairs to find Richard's wife examining the Christmas decorations stored in the front parlor. "Margaret, perfect timing," Victoria waved a manicured hand at the boxes. "These need to go. The estate sale people are coming tomorrow." "But Mrs. Patterson, these decorations are outdated," Victoria cut her off. "Really, those glass ornaments must be ancient. And that old angel for the tree, it's practically falling apart." "The angel?" Margaret's heart raced. The Patterson family angel had topped their Christmas tree for nearly a century. She watched in horror as Victoria lifted it carelessly from its box. "This can go straight to the trash," Victoria declared. "We can't possibly sell something this shabby." "Let me dispose of it properly." Margaret stepped forward quickly. "Some of these old ornaments contain mercury. They need special handling." Victoria wrinkled her nose and practically thrust the angel into Margaret's hands. "Fine, just get rid of it all by tomorrow." As Victoria swept from the room, Margaret cradled the angel carefully. Its porcelain face seemed to hold secrets in its serene smile. She waited until she heard Victoria and Richard leave again before carrying the angel to her small room off the kitchen. Only then did she examine it closely. The angel had always been mounted on the tallest tree they could find, so she'd never had a chance to really look at it. Now, in the light from her window, she noticed something odd, a small seam along the angel's base that shouldn't be there. Margaret's heart pounded as she carefully turned the angel over. Hidden in its base was a tiny compartment. Inside, she found a folded piece of paper in William's handwriting. "The angel watches over more than Christmas. Look to the stars for guidance." The sound of a car pulling up made Margaret quickly hide the angel in her closet. Through her window, she saw a familiar figure climbing out of a town car. Mr. Jenkins, the Patterson family lawyer. He caught her eye and gave a slight nod. The letter in her pocket suddenly felt heavier. Whatever was happening, William Patterson had planned for it. Margaret touched the angel's hidden compartment and remembered his words about traditions meant to last forever. Something told her this was just the beginning of what she would discover. Once Mr. Jenkins's car pulled away, Margaret returned to examining the angel in her room. She carefully opened the hidden compartment again and pulled out William's note. Below the message about stars, she noticed more faint writing. Divine protection comes to those who preserve tradition. A knock at her door made her jump. She quickly hid the angel before opening it to find Mr. Jenkins standing there. "May I come in, Margaret?" the elderly lawyer asked quietly. "We need to talk." Margaret closed the door behind him. Mr. Jenkins had been handling the Patterson family's legal affairs for over 30 years. He took a seat at her small table, declining her offer of tea. "I met with Richard this morning," he said. "He's eager to sell the property quickly. There are already potential buyers coming to view the house today." "So soon?" Margaret's voice cracked. "Richard wants to close a deal before the new year." "But..." Mr. Jenkins leaned forward, lowering his voice. "William left specific instructions about the house. There's a special addendum to his will that can only be read on Christmas Eve." Margaret touched the letter in her pocket. "Does Richard know about this?" "No, and he can't know, not yet." Mr. Jenkins glanced at his watch. "The buyers will be here in an hour. Richard asked me to discuss your retirement package." "But Mr. Patterson, William, he promised I'd always have a home here." "I know. Trust that William had a plan." Mr. Jenkins stood. "Just make sure you're here on Christmas Eve." After he left, Margaret barely had time to collect herself before hearing cars pull up outside. Through her window, she saw Richard greeting a couple in business attire. Minutes later, Victoria arrived with more potential buyers. "This way to the main hall," Richard's voice echoed through the house. "As you can see, the property has enormous potential for development." Margaret followed at a distance, listening as Richard pointed out how easily the historic rooms could be converted into luxury condos. The buyers seemed impressed, taking measurements and photos. "What about the current staff?" one buyer asked, noticing Margaret. "All arrangements will be finalized before sale," Richard said smoothly. "Margaret, could you bring some coffee to the library?" In the kitchen, Margaret's hands shook as she prepared the coffee service. This morning, 3 different groups had toured the house. Each time, Richard spoke about development potential and modernization. Each time, she saw her home of 40 years disappearing. During a quiet moment between tours, Margaret slipped back to her room to examine the angel again. Looking more closely at the base, she noticed tiny stars etched into the porcelain. They formed a pattern that looked familiar. A commotion from upstairs interrupted her thoughts. Victoria's voice carried down the stairs. "Richard, the buyers love it. They're ready to make an offer." Margaret's heart sank. Through her window, she watched Richard shaking hands with a couple in the driveway. They looked pleased. Too pleased. That evening, after everyone had gone, Margaret sat alone in her room with the angel. The stars on its base definitely matched something. But what? She remembered William's note about looking to the stars for guidance. Moving carefully in the dark house, she made her way to William's study. The old star chart he'd kept on his desk was still there. Holding the angel near the chart, Margaret gasped. The pattern of stars matched exactly with the winter sky above Patterson Manor on Christmas Eve. Her hands trembling, Margaret pulled out William's sealed letter. The wax seal bore the Patterson family crest, a design of stars that matched both the angel and the chart. Everything was connected, but how? A text message lit up her phone. "Buyers making serious offer. Meeting tomorrow to discuss staff transitions. Richard." Margaret clutched the angel tighter. William's words echoed in her mind. Divine protection comes to those who preserve tradition. Whatever his plan was, she had to trust it would work. She had 2 weeks until Christmas Eve to figure out how all these pieces fit together. Looking out the study window at the starry winter sky, Margaret whispered a quiet prayer. Somewhere in this house, in its traditions and treasures, William had left a path for her to follow. She just had to be brave enough to follow it. Margaret spent the next morning calling the former Patterson Manor staff. First on her list was Tom Baker, who had served as the groundskeeper for 25 years before retiring. "They can't sell the manor," Tom said when she explained the situation. "What about all the Christmas dinners for folks who had nowhere else to go?" "Richard canceled everything," Margaret sighed. But Tom, I found something in the attic. Letters about my mother. She knew William when they were children. Meet me at Betty's diner in an hour, Tom said. I'll call the others. At the diner, Margaret found 5 former staff members waiting. Tom, Susan from the kitchen, James who used to handle maintenance, and the Carter sisters who had helped with housekeeping. They grabbed the large corner booth, their old spot from staff lunches. We all got our jobs through William, Susan said. He had a way of finding people who needed a chance. Margaret pulled out one of the letters she'd found. Listen to this. The little girl who saved me in the storm. I've searched for her family for years. When I finally found her daughter, I knew I had to help. Some debts can never be repaid, only passed forward. Your mother saved William? James leaned forward. Before Margaret could answer, her phone buzzed. A text from Richard. Security team arriving today. All staff meetings must be cleared through new head of security. Security team? Tom frowned. For an empty house? Victoria's idea, Margaret said. She thinks. The diner's bell jingled. Everyone fell silent as Victoria walked in, looking out of place in her designer clothes. She spotted their table and walked over. A staff meeting without authorization? Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Margaret, you know the new policies. We're just having coffee, Susan said. Old friends catching up. How nice. Victoria's voice dripped with fake sweetness. But the house requires Margaret's attention. There are more buyers coming today. On her way back to the manor, Margaret saw 3 men in dark uniforms installing security cameras. Inside, she found more letters while cleaning William's study. Each one revealed more about her mother and William's childhood. A car door slammed outside. Margaret looked up to see a young woman stepping out of a taxi. Sarah Patterson, Richard's daughter from his first marriage. Her bright pink hair and ripped jeans were a sharp contrast to her father's corporate style. Margaret, Sarah rushed to hug her. Dad finally told me what's happening. This is crazy. Grandpa loved this place. Your father has his reasons, Margaret said carefully. His reasons are dollar signs, Sarah crossed her arms. And Victoria's been in his ear about property development since day one. Margaret hesitated, then made a decision. Sarah, I need to show you something. In Margaret's room, Sarah examined the angel and the star chart. Grandpa was always interested in astronomy, she said. He used to show me constellations from his study window. There's more. Margaret showed her the letters about her mother. Sarah read them quickly, her expression growing serious. Dad needs to see these. No, Margaret said firmly. Your grandfather was very specific about timing. Everything has to wait until Christmas Eve. But a commotion outside interrupted them. Victoria was directing security guards to block off the entrance to the staff wing. Complete lockdown after 6 p.m., she was saying. No unauthorized meetings or gatherings. Sarah's phone chimed. Dad's calling a family meeting tonight. They're announcing the sale. Margaret touched the angel hidden in her closet. We need to figure out what your grandfather's plan was before it's too late. I'll help, Sarah said. Victoria has Dad completely convinced this development deal will be his big legacy. But Grandpa's legacy was helping people, not making money. As Sarah left for the family meeting, Margaret pulled out William's sealed letter again. The stars in the family crest seemed to shine in the fading light. Somewhere in this house were more pieces to the puzzle. She just had to find them before Victoria's security team locked everything down. Her phone lit up with a message from Tom. Got everyone together. We're ready to help. Just say when. Margaret smiled for the first time that day. William had always said Christmas was about bringing people together. Maybe that was part of his plan too. The next morning, Margaret woke early to read through the remaining letters before the security team's shift began. Each envelope revealed more about her mother's connection to William Patterson. One letter, dated 40 years ago, made her hands shake. Today I finally found her. Mary Thompson's daughter works at the local diner. Her mother, the brave girl who pulled me from that frozen pond, passed away years ago. But I can still repay my debt. Her daughter Margaret will have a place here at Patterson Manor as long as she lives. Margaret wiped her eyes, remembering that day. She'd been struggling to support herself after her mother's death when William Patterson walked into the diner and offered her a job. A soft knock interrupted her memories. Sarah slipped into the room, closing the door quietly. "Dad signed the preliminary sale agreement last night," she said. "But I found something in Grandpa's study before Victoria's team locked it up." Sarah pulled out an old newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local girl saves Patterson heir. Young Mary Thompson risks life in Christmas Eve rescue." "There's more," Sarah said. "I overheard Victoria on the phone with the developers. They're planning to tear everything down, even the old chapel where they hold the Christmas charity dinner." "Your grandfather started that tradition," Margaret said. "Every Christmas Eve, feeding 50 people who had nowhere else to go. Victoria convinced Dad it's a liability. She's posting guards to keep people from gathering this year." The sound of footsteps in the hall made them both freeze. Victoria's voice carried through the door. "Check every room. I want to know about any meetings or unusual activity." Sarah quickly hid in the closet as Victoria entered without knocking. "Margaret, we need to discuss the staff housing situation," Victoria said. "The new owners will take possession January 1st. You'll need to vacate by December 26th. "The day after Christmas?" Margaret kept her voice steady. "Consider it a Christmas deadline." Victoria smiled thinly. "We've arranged a lovely retirement community placement." After Victoria left, Sarah emerged from the closet. "She's horrible. We have to stop this." "Your grandfather had a plan," Margaret said. "These letters, the angel, the star pattern, it's all connected to Christmas Eve." Sarah's phone buzzed. "Dad wants everyone at the house tonight. They're meeting with the developers." That evening, Margaret watched from her window as expensive cars filled the driveway. Victoria had arranged a dinner to finalize the sale details. A text from Tom appeared. "Got the old crew together at Betty's diner. Found some interesting town records about the property." "Can't leave," Margaret replied. "Security watching everything." "No problem," Tom wrote back. "Sarah's picking them up now." An hour later, Sarah slipped the documents under Margaret's door. Among them was a yellowed letter from William Patterson Sr. dated 1943. This land was given to help others. The chapel, the Christmas dinner, the open doors to those in need, these traditions must be maintained. The star will guide the way. Margaret looked at the angel's star pattern again. Something about the chapel. She remembered William always insisted the Christmas tree with the angel be placed precisely in the chapel's east window. Her phone lit up with another message, this time from Mr. Jenkins. "Don't let them sign anything before Christmas Eve." William's instructions were very specific about timing. Outside her room, Victoria was leading developers on a tour. The chapel can be converted into luxury penthouses. The views of the valley are spectacular. Margaret clutched the letters from her mother's past. William Patterson hadn't just given her a job, he'd spent years searching for his rescuer's family. Now his son was about to destroy everything he'd built. But William had left them a trail to follow. The stars, the angel, the chapel, Christmas Eve, all pieces of a puzzle they had to solve in less than 2 weeks. Sarah texted again. "More buyers coming tomorrow. Victoria's got them staying at the Valley Inn. Dad's not even checking their development plans anymore." Margaret touched the sealed letter in her pocket. "Not yet," William had said. "Wait for Christmas Eve." She just hoped they'd figured out his plan before it was too late. Richard stormed into the manor early the next morning, waving a stack of papers. "Who contacted the Historical Society?" he demanded, finding Margaret in the kitchen. "The Historical Society?" Margaret set down her coffee cup. "Someone filed a request to have the manor designated as a historical landmark." Richard slapped the papers on the counter. "This could derail the entire sale." Before Margaret could respond, Victoria rushed in. "Don't worry, darling. Our lawyers are handling it. That old chapel might cause some issues, but we'll fight the designation." Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face innocent. "The chapel where we feed 50 people every Christmas Eve, the one Grandpa always said was the heart of the community? That tradition is ending," Victoria said firmly. "In fact, I've arranged for an estate sale. We need to clear everything out before the new year." "An estate sale?" Margaret's voice shook. "But the Christmas decorations will be sold to the highest bidder." Victoria pulled out her phone. "I've already contacted several antique dealers. They're very interested in those vintage ornaments." Sarah caught Margaret's eye and gave a slight nod. They both knew the angel was safely hidden. "Margaret," Richard cleared his throat. "About your contract, our lawyers found some irregularities." "Irregularities?" Margaret touched the sealed letter in her pocket. "Your lifetime position isn't legally binding," Victoria cut in. "It was a verbal agreement with William, nothing more." Sarah stepped forward. "Dad, you can't." "The decision is made," Richard interrupted. "The sale is moving forward. The manor will be developed into luxury condos. It's time everyone accepted that." The front door chimed. Victoria hurried to greet more potential buyers, leaving Richard to study the historical society papers. Sarah waited until they were alone. "Tom found more documents at the town hall," she whispered to Margaret. "Something about the chapel's original land grant." A commotion from the front hall interrupted them. "You can't just barge in here." Victoria's voice rang out. Mr. Jenkins walked into the kitchen, followed by a woman in a business suit. "Actually, they can. Margaret, this is Miss Chen from the State Historical Commission. This property has significant historical value," Miss Chen said, opening a folder. "The chapel alone meets 3 criteria for preservation." Richard's face reddened. "Now see here. The commission has placed a temporary hold on any development plans," Mr. Jenkins said calmly, "at least until after the holidays." "You're behind this," Victoria pointed at Margaret. "You're trying to sabotage the sale." "The application came from multiple community members," Ms. Chen replied. "The commission takes public input very seriously." After the officials left, Richard paced the kitchen. "This is a minor setback. The lawyers will handle it." "The Christmas Eve dinner is still technically scheduled," Sarah pointed out. "Shouldn't we at least?" "No," Victoria snapped. "No more traditions, no more Christmas, no more community events. This property is being sold, and that's final." Later that evening, Margaret found Sarah in the chapel, staring at the empty space where the Christmas tree usually stood. "Look at this," Sarah pointed to markings on the floor. "Grandpa always insisted the tree go exactly here, and the angel had to face east." Margaret examined the markings. They matched the star pattern from the angel's base. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Tom. "Found something big in the county records. Meeting at Betty's tomorrow morning." "Victoria's watching all the exits," Sarah warned. "She hired more security." "Then we'll have to be more careful," Margaret said. "Your grandfather left us these clues for a reason. We just have to figure out what they mean before it's too late." Through the chapel windows, they could see Victoria directing workmen to post private property signs. The developer's stakes marking future building sites dotted the snowy lawn like grave markers. Mr. Jenkins had bought them some time, but the question remained. What was William Patterson's plan, and would they solve his puzzle before Christmas Eve? Mr. Jenkins arrived at Margaret's room before sunrise, slipping past the security guards during their shift change. "William knew this might happen," he said, pulling out a folder. "He left specific instructions about the Christmas Eve dinner. It must take place, and there must be exactly 50 guests." "But Victoria's banned all gatherings," Margaret said. "The original land grant included a provision for public access to the chapel," Mr. Jenkins explained. "They can't legally stop a traditional religious gathering." Margaret showed him the angel and the star pattern. "Everything seems connected to the chapel." "William was very particular about that chapel." Mr. Jenkins nodded. "Every Christmas Eve he'd check the angel himself, making sure it faced exactly east." A knock at the door made them both jump. Sarah peeked in. "Victoria's here early. She's meeting with people from the auction house." Through her window, Margaret watched Victoria leading appraisers through the house. They were marking furniture and artwork with yellow tags. "She's planning an auction for Christmas Eve," Sarah whispered. "She wants to clear everything out before the Historical Commission can intervene." Mr. Jenkins frowned. "That's not possible without proper notice to beneficiaries." "Since when has Victoria cared about proper notice?" Sarah pulled out her phone. "Look what she's offering the staff." The email showed substantial bonuses for any staff who supported the sale and testified against historical designation. "She tried this with maintenance crew first," Sarah explained. "Offered them triple their holiday bonus to skip the Christmas Eve dinner." Margaret's phone buzzed with a message from Tom. "Meeting at the diner. Bring the angel." "Go," Mr. Jenkins said. "I'll handle things here." At Betty's diner, Margaret found not just the old staff, but dozens of community members. Tom had spread the word. The chapel's been part of community Christmas celebrations for 80 years, Reverend Miller said. We can't let them shut it down. William Patterson helped half the people in this room, Betty added. Gave them jobs, paid medical bills, kept the food bank stocked. Margaret placed the angel on the table. There's something about this and the chapel. William left clues. Tom spread out the old blueprints. The chapel was built first before the manor. Look at the foundation stones. The original plans showed a star pattern in the chapel's foundation, the same pattern on the angel's base. Sarah burst into the diner. Victoria's offering the antique dealers early access if they'll come today instead of waiting for the auction. She can't do that, Mr. Jenkins said from the doorway. Not without. He stopped as Victoria herself walked into the diner. The room fell silent. Well, isn't this cozy? Victoria looked around. A little resistance meeting? Just breakfast, Betty said firmly. Last I checked, that's still legal. Victoria's eyes narrowed at the blueprints. Planning some last-minute historical claims? Don't bother. Richard's lawyers are handling everything. After she left, Reverend Miller stood up. We're having that Christmas Eve dinner. Victoria can't stop all of us. The whole town will come, Betty declared. That's exactly what William would have wanted, Mr. Jenkins smiled. Community over profit. If Margaret studied the chapel blueprints again. The star pattern, the angel, the east-facing window, William had left them a message. But what were they missing? Sarah's phone chimed. Dad just announced the auction, December 24th at noon. He's determined to clear everything out before Christmas. Then we need to work faster, Margaret said. These decorations, the chapel's design, they're not just traditions. They're part of William's plan. Tom pointed to the blueprint. The chapel's cornerstone. There's something written here in the margins. Margaret leaned closer. In William's handwriting, the light at Christmas reveals all. The pieces were starting to come together. Now they just had to hold on until Christmas Eve and keep Victoria from selling everything before they could solve the puzzle. Margaret spent the evening examining every Christmas decoration she'd managed to save from Victoria's auction plans. Each piece seemed to carry a hint of William's puzzle. Look at this, Sarah said, holding up an old ornament. There are tiny numbers etched around the edge. They spread all the rescued decorations on Margaret's small table. Each piece had similar markings, numbers, stars, or compass points. They're coordinates, Sarah realized. Grandpa was always talking about celestial navigation. These matched the star pattern from the angel. A knock at the door made them quickly hide everything. Victoria entered without waiting for a response. Richard just finished a call with the developers, she announced. They're willing to close the deal immediately, at an even higher price. What about the historical commission's hold? Margaret asked. Money solves everything. Victoria smiled. The developers will start demolition January 1st. They're not interested in preserving anything. After she left, Sarah pulled out her phone. Look what Dad just sent me. The email showed architectural plans for a luxury complex. The chapel would be demolished first. They're not even trying to save any of it. Sarah's voice cracked. Margaret's phone buzzed. A message from Tom. County records show the chapel land was deeded separately. Different restrictions. Before they could discuss it, they heard Richard in the hallway. The buyers are willing to handle all legal challenges. We can close next week. Perfect, Victoria replied. I'll tell the auction house to move everything out immediately. Sarah grabbed her jacket. I need to see these buyers myself. At the Valley Inn, Sarah discovered something disturbing. The development company was just formed 2 months ago, she told Margaret later. Victoria's brother owns it. She's been planning this all along, Margaret realized. They worked late into the night, plotting the coordinates from the decorations. Each one pointed to a specific spot in the chapel. The pattern forms a perfect star, Sarah said, but only on Christmas Eve when the light hits exactly right. Another message from Tom appeared. Found something in the Old Town Council minutes. The chapel has special status during Christmas week. Margaret looked at the sealed letter again. Not yet, William had said. Wait for Christmas Eve. Victoria's brother just filed demolition permits, Sarah reported, checking her phone. They're not even waiting for the sale to finalize. The next morning, Richard called a staff meeting. The sale is moving forward. The developers are prepared to handle any legal issues or community protests. What about the Christmas Eve dinner? Someone asked. Cancelled permanently, Victoria announced. The property will be closed to the public effective immediately. Sarah stood up. You can't do this. This place means something to people. It means profit, Victoria snapped. Your grandfather's sentimental traditions are outdated. Later in the chapel, Margaret and Sarah plotted the star coordinates on the floor. The angel goes here, Sarah pointed. And on Christmas Eve, the light through that window. A commotion outside interrupted them. Workers were putting up construction fencing around the property. They're really going to tear it all down, Sarah whispered. Margaret touched the letter in her pocket. The star pattern, the coordinates, the chapel's design. William had embedded his message in every Christmas tradition. But would they solve it in time? Her phone lit up with messages from town residents. We're fighting this. The Christmas Eve dinner must happen. Count us in. Victoria's voice echoed from the driveway. Start packing everything. I want this place cleared out before Christmas. Sarah checked her phone again. Dad's not even reading the development plans anymore. He's just signing whatever Victoria puts in front of him. The construction fence cast long shadows across the snowy ground. Soon it would completely surround the chapel, cutting off the community from its heart. But William's puzzle was becoming clearer. Every decoration, every tradition pointed to something happening in the chapel on Christmas Eve. They just had to hold on until then. 2 days before Christmas Eve, Mr. Jenkins arrived with unexpected news. The judge granted our emergency injunction, he announced to Margaret and Sarah. They can't start demolition until after the holidays. Victoria won't like that, Sarah said. She already knows. She's been calling my office all morning. Mr. Jenkins smiled. The judge was particularly interested in the chapel's historical status during Christmas week. Margaret's phone buzzed with a notification. The local newspaper's website had posted a story, Historic Patterson Manor Christmas Tradition Threatened by Development. Victoria's going to be furious, Sarah said, reading the article. They interviewed half the town about the Christmas Eve dinner. Right on cue, Victoria burst into the room. What is this? She thrust her phone at them. Social media is exploding with Save the Manor posts. The community cares about this place, Margaret said quietly. The community doesn't own it, Victoria snapped. And this publicity is threatening the development deal. She caught herself, but Sarah noticed the slip. Your deal? You mean your brother's company? Victoria's face hardened. Richard, tell them the sale is final. But Richard, following behind her, looked uncertain. Victoria, maybe we should review the development plans more carefully. There's no time, Victoria insisted. The market could change. We need to close this deal now. Mrs. Patterson? A security guard appeared at the door. There are people gathering at the front gate. They went to the window. A small crowd had formed, carrying signs, Save Our Christmas Tradition and Keep Patterson Manor Open. Call the police, Victoria ordered. They're on public property, Mr. Jenkins said. Perfectly legal. Richard studied the crowd. Those are our neighbors, people Dad helped over the years. They're trespassing, Victoria insisted. Actually, Mr. Plusler, Jenkins pulled out some papers. The original property covenant includes a public right-of-way to the chapel during Christmas week. Victoria snatched the documents. This is ridiculous. Richard, do something. But Richard was reading the newspaper article on his phone. Dad really did all this? Paid for Sandra Miller's cancer treatment? Saved Tom Baker's farm during the drought? Your father understood what community means, Margaret said. Victoria pulled Richard aside. We're so close to closing this deal. Don't let sentiment cloud your judgment. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. Sarah's phone kept buzzing with messages from supporters. The Historical Commission representatives are here, Mr. Jenkins announced. 2 officials entered, carrying folders. We've received hundreds of letters supporting the historical designation, one said. The chapel alone has significant cultural importance. We have buyers ready to close, Victoria argued. You can't just... We can and we have, the official replied. The commission has voted to fast-track the historical review. Richard looked at the growing crowd, then at the Christmas decorations Victoria had ordered removed. Dad always said the Christmas Eve dinner was his most important tradition. It was a liability, Victoria snapped. A waste of money and resources. It was about helping people, Margaret said. Everything William did was about helping people. Richard picked up one of the protest signs someone had left. Patterson Manor, heart of the community. Your father planned for this, Mr. Jenkins told him. There's more to discover on Christmas Eve. Victoria's phone rang. What do you mean? You're reconsidering the offer? She walked away, arguing with the developers. Sarah touched her father's arm. Dad, look at what this place means to people. Through the window, they watched more neighbors joining the protest. The crowd now stretched down the street. Margaret felt William's sealed letter in her pocket. Just 2 more days until Christmas Eve. 2 days to save everything he'd built. The question was, would Richard finally see what his father had always known about the true value of Patterson Manor? Christmas Eve morning arrived with the biggest snowstorm Vermont had seen in years. Margaret woke to find Patterson Manor surrounded by deep drifts, the construction fence barely visible under the snow. Her phone was filled with messages. The developers had canceled their final property inspection due to weather. All roads into Miller's Creek were nearly impassable. The weather report says it's getting worse, Sarah said, rushing into Margaret's room. Victoria's furious. The buyers can't make it for the final contract signing. Where is Victoria? Margaret asked. Stuck here. She and Dad tried to leave for the lawyer's office, but their car couldn't make it past the gate. Margaret's phone rang. It was Tom. Betty's setting up the Christmas Eve dinner anyway. The whole town's helping. This storm won't stop us. Through her window, Margaret could see people arriving on foot, carrying dishes and decorations. The construction fence couldn't keep them from reaching the chapel's side entrance, just as William's property covenant had guaranteed. Victoria appeared in Margaret's doorway. What are all these people doing here? Richard, we have to stop this. But Richard stood at the window, watching his neighbors trudge through the snow. Dad never missed this dinner, not once in 40 years. We have a contract to sign, Victoria insisted. In this storm? Sarah challenged. Even the buyers can't make it. Margaret checked the time. The sealed letter in her pocket seemed to grow heavier as the hour approached. The chapel's filling up, Sarah reported, checking her phone. Live video showed people gathering, setting up tables, decorating. This is trespassing, Victoria declared. I'm calling the police. They're busy with emergency calls from the storm. Sarah smiled. Everyone else is here anyway. She held up her phone, showing the live stream comments. Chief Thompson serving coffee. Mayor Williams brought cookies. Richard watched the video feed. I remember when Dad started this tradition, just a few families that first year. A waste of resources, Victoria snapped. These people have no right. Actually, they do. Mr. Jenkins appeared, shaking snow from his coat. The chapel's public access easement is quite clear. William made sure of that. Margaret touched the angel in her bag. It was almost time. The developers are threatening to pull out, Victoria said to Richard. We have to do something. But Richard was still watching the video. The mayor was telling stories about William helping families during hard times. The police chief described how William had funded the town's first ambulance. Dad never told me any of this. Richard said quietly. Margaret checked the time again. We should go to the chapel. Absolutely not, Victoria blocked the door. No one is going anywhere until the power went out, plunging the manor into darkness. The chapel has a generator, Sarah said. Grandpa installed it last year. Through the windows, they could see the chapel lights glowing warmly. More people were arriving on foot, carrying lanterns and flashlights through the storm. It's time, Margaret said, taking out the angel and William's sealed letter. What is that? Victoria demanded. Dad's handwriting. Richard recognized the envelope. Sarah's phone lit up the darkness. Everyone's asking where you are, Dad. They're waiting. Outside, the storm had created a hushed, magical silence. The chapel bells began to ring, cutting through the swirling snow. Richard looked at Victoria's angry face, then at the welcoming lights of the chapel. 40 years of Christmas Eve traditions waited in the balance. Let's go, he said finally. I want to know what Dad was trying to tell us. As they made their way through the snow, Margaret held the angel carefully. In just a few minutes, when she placed it in its proper position, William Patterson's final message would be revealed. The only question was, would it be enough to save everything he built? The chapel was filled with warmth and light when they entered. 50 people, exactly as William had specified, turned to watch them. Margaret carried the angel carefully through the crowd. "Richard," Betty called from the makeshift kitchen. "Your father's recipe for the Christmas punch is on the counter. He always said only a Patterson could make it." Richard hesitated, then walked over to read the handwritten recipe card. "This is completely inappropriate," Victoria protested. "These people have no right to." "To what?" Sarah challenged. "To celebrate Christmas? To honor Grandpa's tradition?" Margaret moved to the east window, where the Christmas tree stood waiting. She could feel William's sealed letter in her pocket. "Dad's punch recipe," Richard said quietly, looking at the card. "He used to make this every Christmas Eve when I was little, before I left for college." Tom stepped forward. "William helped me save my farm during the drought of '95. Never asked for anything in return except that I join the Christmas Eve dinner every year. He paid for my daughter's surgery," Betty added, said the only repayment was to help cook this dinner. More people began sharing stories. The mayor described how William had quietly funded the town's first medical clinic. The police chief told how Patterson Manor had housed displaced families after the flood of '89. Victoria tried to pull Richard away. "This is just emotional manipulation. The development deal was never real," Mr. Jenkins interrupted. "I had your brother's company investigated. It was created solely to purchase and demolish this property." The room fell silent. Victoria's face flushed. "You knew?" Richard turned to his wife. "This whole time? The property is worth millions if developed," Victoria said defensively. "Your father was wasting its potential with all these charitable projects." Margaret reached the Christmas tree. The star pattern on the floor matched the coordinates from the decorations perfectly. "It's time," Mr. Jenkins said, checking his watch. Margaret placed the angel on top of the tree, aligning it exactly as William had always insisted. The moment she did, the last rays of the setting sun broke through the storm clouds, shining through the east window. The light hit the angel, creating a pattern of stars across the chapel wall. As everyone watched, the light revealed words carved into the stone, invisible until this exact moment on Christmas Eve. "The true value of property lies in its service to others." "Dad's favorite saying," Richard whispered. Margaret opened William's sealed letter with trembling hands. As she read it aloud, Victoria's face grew darker. "To my son Richard, if you're hearing this on Christmas Eve, then Margaret has protected our family's true legacy. This property was never meant to generate wealth. Its purpose is to serve our community. 40 years ago, Margaret's mother saved my life on Christmas Eve. She refused any reward, saying helping others was reward enough. Her sacrifice taught me what matters most. The chapel and manor are already legally protected. I established a trust, activated upon this Christmas Eve reading, that will preserve them forever as a community center and shelter for those in need. Richard, your mother taught you compassion before she passed. Don't let ambition steal that from you. The true Patterson legacy isn't in property values, it's in the lives we touch and the help we give others. The choice is yours now. You can fight the trust in court, or you can honor our family's real purpose. Look around you. These people aren't trespassers. They're the reason our family prospered. Every Christmas Eve, this chapel reminds us what matters most. Choose wisely, son." Richard looked at the gathered townspeople, then at the development plans in his hands. Victoria grabbed his arm. "Don't be foolish. Think of the money." But Richard was watching Betty serve his father's Christmas punch, watching the mayor help Tom hang a wreath, watching Sarah hug Margaret as tears rolled down both their faces. The choice that would determine Patterson Manor's destiny rested with him now. Richard stood silent for a long moment, holding his father's letter. The chapel remained hushed, waiting. Even Victoria didn't speak. Finally, Richard walked to the window where the angel's light still cast its pattern on the wall. "I forgot something very important," he said. "I forgot who my father really was." He turned to face the gathered townspeople. "When Mom died, Dad could have sent me to boarding school, could have focused on business. Instead, he brought me to every Christmas Eve dinner, made sure I helped serve food, heard people's stories. Victoria stepped forward. Richard, don't. No. Richard's voice was firm. I've done enough listening to the wrong advice. He faced the crowd again. My father built something precious here. Not the building, the community, the traditions, the helping hands. He walked to the development plans lying on a nearby table. Without hesitation, he tore them in half. The sound echoed through the chapel. Victoria grabbed her coat. You're making a terrible mistake. No, Richard said. I made my mistake when I forgot what Dad taught me. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Hello? Yes, this is Richard Patterson. Cancel the sale. All of it. Victoria stormed out into the snow. No one moved to stop her. Margaret unfolded the rest of William's letter. There's more, she said. To Margaret, you've been more than an employee. You've been family. The daughter of the woman who saved my life grew up to save my family's soul. The manor is your home for life, legally and eternally. Help Richard remember who we really are. Sarah hugged her father. Grandpa would be so proud. The trust documents are ready, Mr. Jenkins said. The manor and chapel will be permanently designated as a community center. Richard, as trustee, you'll oversee continuing all your father's charitable works. With Margaret's help, Richard added. She always knew what Dad wanted this place to be. Betty started serving the Christmas punch. Tom and the mayor brought out the dinner dishes. The celebration that William Patterson had started 40 years ago continued, exactly as he'd planned. There's one more thing, Margaret said. She opened the angel's hidden compartment and removed a small key. Your father left this for you, Richard, for when you made the right choice. The key opened William's desk in the manor. Inside, they found albums filled with letters and photos. Stories of lives changed, medical bills paid, mortgages saved, children sent to college. 40 years of quiet generosity documented in William Patterson's careful handwriting. Dad never told me any of this, Richard said softly. He wanted you to find your own way to helping others, Margaret explained, just like my mother showed him. The Christmas Eve dinner lasted well into the night. The storm outside had calmed, as if nature itself approved of the choice made in the chapel. 1 year later, the Patterson Manor Community Center was thriving. Richard had taken up residence in the East Wing, while Margaret continued managing the property. The Christmas Eve dinner now served 100 people instead of 50. Sarah created a scholarship program in William's name. The chapel hosted community events year-round. The manor's empty rooms became temporary housing for families in need. And every Christmas Eve, when Margaret placed the angel atop the tree and the setting sun shone through the east window, the words on the chapel wall reminded everyone of William Patterson's legacy. The true value of property lies in its service to others. Richard often paused by that window, watching new stories of hope unfold in the home his father had created. The development plans in Victoria were long gone, but the true spirit of Patterson Manor lived on, touching lives and helping others, just as William had always intended. Merry Christmas, Dad, Richard whispered each year as the chapel bells rang. I finally understood. What a heartwarming story of love, faith, and the true meaning of Christmas. If this tale of the Patterson Manor touched your heart, please hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What Christmas traditions do you hold dear in your family? Have you ever experienced a holiday miracle that changed your life? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more touching stories that remind us what truly matters in life. Remember, just like William Patterson knew, our greatest legacy isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in the lives we touch and the hearts we heal.